Hello and welcome. Today is World Animal Day and I have been asked by the Mouth and Foot Painting Artists, which is the organisation I work with, to do a tutorial for you all. So first I'd like to talk a little bit about the MFPA. We are an international self-help association of artists who are we're all disabled and we're unable to use our hands to create artwork, so instead we use our mouth or our feet, or some artists even use a combination. It was formed by disabled mouth artist and sculptor Arnulf Erik Stegman. His vision was to bring together a group of like-minded artists throughout Europe, which it's now actually become international, we're all over the world, and to provide them a way to live a fulfilling life without charity. So our association basically creates artworks to be printed in the form of cards, wrapping paper, books, jigsaws, you name it, we do it. If you'd like to find out more or purchase some of our work, you can visit the mfpa.uk website or the vdmfk.com website. Okay, so let's get started with this tutorial. Today's reference photo was provided by photographer Matt Finstead. He is amazing. Thank you so much for letting me use this. It's a beautiful photo. It is a European badger. You should be able to see it in the bottom corner of the screen. I am working on the iPad Pro on the Procreate app, but you can follow along with anything you like. I will be using the pencil tools, so I recommend for you, if you're working with paper, either use some drawing pencils or some charcoals will probably work really well, or even chalk. Yeah, any of those. We're only going to do simple black and white for now, I think. So yeah, let's get started. So the first thing I've done is I have gridded the photo that we're going to be working from, and the reason I've done that is because when you're just starting out, it's really useful just to help you learn perspectives and line things up and basically make sure everything's anatomically correct and everything like that. You don't always need a grid. Personally, I like to sketch and find my way around, and eventually I use a lot of finding lines, which is where you draw several lines together until you find kind of the right flow for the image. But using grids is good in the beginning when you're still learning. But after them, by all means, feel free to sketch and experiment and enjoy. You can apply these techniques to any drawing you like, really. So, for those who are following digitally, you can use any app, you can even use your phone. Okay, so let's get some guidelines in first. Now, because we've got the grid, we can section things off and make them a little bit easier and more bite-sized. So we know that the ear comes in at around the 5th square. So we can mark off as we go, very roughly, just an approximation, there's no pressure, of where everything is going to sit in the picture. And we can get our angles right. And these are basically like section lines, so they're not our definite lines, they're not anything that's particularly set in stone or accurate, but we're aiming to be as close as possible. And we can do several lines at once. We can do whatever we want, let's face it. But yeah, making mistakes is how we eventually get to where we need to be. So just loosely sketch with your pencil or charcoal or whatever you're using. and just roughly give yourself an idea of the shape of the animal, and really look at his anatomy and how everything attaches together and moves, and if it helps, watch videos before you start drawing. Or work from life. Or it's not particularly popular among many people, but I actually really like using taxidermy for reference material because the animal is anatomically correct and it's not going to move. Even observing things like skulls and bone structures, they're really useful for things like this and learning about the subject that you're drawing. I love these little tufts on the ears. That's going to be fun later on. So then we're just working our way down, finding the shape as we go. So badgers are related to animals like ferrets, weasels, otters, wolverines. They're very, very adaptable animals, but they prefer to live on grasslands. That's their favourite environment, and they can be found throughout the UK, Ireland, Europe, and even Asia. They're quite widespread. There are other species that are also found in places like Africa, and that one is called the honey badger. So now we're just going to work out where the neck is. And you'll notice I'm not really doing rounded, smooth lines. I'm being quite angular with it. And that's because most animals aren't as smooth, rounded shapes as people draw. It's one of the big mistakes. It tends to make them look lazy or even overweight. The more straight lines and shapes that we find, more it kind of turns them up a little bit and makes them more like, they look more dynamic. Now there are some sweeping lines, and it's important to get them in the right places and do not let yourself get too carried away by them. Because when we see something we tend to be like, yeah! Starting to hint at certain areas like where some markings might be, because they'll help me with guidelines later as well. Everything is a guide. If you're drawing a subject that you can't grid because it's like real life or something, use other body parts to work out sizes and shapes and angles, or even the environment around. Instead of looking at the shape of the badger's head, we could look at the shape, like this archway between the neck and the chin. If we don't look at it as a neck and a chin, if we look at it as a green arc, which is what the grass is, which is negative drawing, that can help us get certain things, especially because our eyes are prone to a lot of optical illusion. We see things that aren't there, and we have this bad habit of assuming things, so we draw what we think we see rather than what we actually do see. And the whole part of art is to teach ourselves to actually look at what is there and be as true to our interpretation as we can. Just neatening up some of these lines with an eraser. And as you can see, all of a sudden I've jumped into doing this stripe down his face. Now at the minute it feels very empty to me, so by putting these things in, it just helps me see how it's actually shaping up and how different parts are going to fit, like the eyes. And there's no set rule to how you do this. Like, this is just how I work. You make it fit you. So me personally, I won't just do the basic markings and lines. I will draw in lines that are to do with things like tonal differences, like shadows and highlights, so that later on when I'm drawing and I'm getting really involved with it, I have those lines there to remind me that, no, that bit's light, don't fill it in, or things like that. So badgers are such fascinating animals. They live in groups called clans, and they're very social. They share a territory and they share a set, and the sets can be huge. We're talking like 100 meters long sometimes. So it's basically just like us. They have a set which is laid out like our houses, I suppose, in the sense of they've got different chambers, like we have different rooms, and each chamber might have a purpose. So some of them might be just for general living, but then they'll have one that's specifically for going to the bathroom in, for example, and that'll be separate to all the others to keep the place clean. Some of them might even have a birthing chamber to raise their young in. And although they can mate anytime they want, they actually only give birth at a set time of the year. So they can actually mate and then store the sperm for the right time to give birth and make sure that their babies are born at a season where they have a better chance of survival, which is really cool. So they'll normally give birth somewhere between the middle to the end of winter and March, I believe. So like springtime. See, I was saying earlier about drawing in different light, and I'm just putting in that nice perfect light in the eye. I'm just needing up some lines here. I'm just using the eraser tool. I know this looks really neat for an eraser, but you can actually do it, and you can achieve it with electric eraser even. And it's basically got a fine point and it spins, so you can pretty much erase things as neatly as you could with a pencil. You can actually get pencil erasers too, where it's in a pencil and you can sharpen it, which I personally love. So you see, I was just bringing this line through, this stripe on his face. It can really start to shape up the whole thing. And just make him appear a little bit more 3D before we actually start shading. And we just lightly sketch him away. Nothing too set in stone. I've misjudged that bit. So we'll just erase that little line. Notice I never say I've got it wrong, because I think that's totally beating yourself up for no reason. Like I say, every mistake is a learning curve. So I'm just putting a finding line in and erasing some of the bits out, so I can use it as a guide to meet that about this guide now, because we have a better idea of where we're going with it. So we're just going to about this line ever so lightly for the moment, because I think I've misjudged the depth of that. And then we'll continue on with this stripe, which actually lines up quite nicely with this part of the glue. So the stripes are never perfectly straight or anything. There's always interesting little nicks and curves and all different things like that, and they'll make the animal unique. It's worth putting those things in because they're what help make that animal who they are. Like, he's not just a badger, he's Bob. Because they are all unique. So yeah, one good reason for getting these stripes in, we can now see that I actually misjudged this section. So what we do is we draw it again. So we work out where our line went wrong, which is about here. And we just start shaping them up a little bit better. So sometimes you might want to completely rip out an outline, and sometimes you might just want to lightly fade it out until you've found what's right for you. So yes, this line should have been here. And it's amazing how miscounting one square or misjudging the length of one thing can really throw off the whole drawing. So it's really important to keep observing and keep looking. From the start, I had a feeling something wasn't quite right, but sometimes it's best just to keep going and persevering until you can put your finger on it and hit the nail on the head, so to speak. And once you've worked it out, you'll find everything starts to fall into place. So let's get rid of this line. Now for those of you using digital, you can actually use your magic wand tool and circle it a part of the animal or whatever you've done wrong and fix it that way by moving it around. If you like the shape of something and you don't want to have to redraw it out, but because we have some people who are following traditionally, I'm going to erase that and draw it again because it's only fair, because I know I'd be frustrated. But yeah, if you are drawing digitally, you can. If I was like, oh, the eye is not quite high enough, I could just circle the eye and move it up a little bit. It just saves erasing and redrawing. And mainly what I'm doing is I'm not actually looking at what's in the square, I'm looking at the start and stop points. So where the line enters on the square grid and where it exits. And that's basically all you need to start getting the right shape together. So then we'll put this ear back in. You'll notice I'll do this a lot as well. It's just to get a better, to look at the image as a whole rather than be focused on this one section type thing. Because the thing is, it doesn't have to be exact. We're not photocopiers, we're interpreters. So as long as it's not looking like a giraffe and it's looking like a badger, basically, you're all good. And as long as it's pleasing to you. So if there are parts you'd like to change, then change them. Just make sure if you're doing something like an individual animal, that you don't change it so much that it's unrecognisable. Same with people. There are some areas you can maybe get away with, like maybe they've got a big spot on their face, or with an animal it might have a big fly on it or something. You can get rid of that because that's fine. It's not a permanent part of them, but there'll be certain animals that might have a unique trait about them. So like I was saying about these stripes down the face, they have little notches in them and they're quite unique to that animal. And the same goes for people, like little freckles and stuff like that. Try and get, obviously if someone's face is covered, you don't want to be sat there painstakingly putting every single one exactly where it's supposed to be. But if there's certain ones that stand out, that make that person who they are, make sure you include those. I hope that makes sense. So we'll notice things like noses. People tend to do these big round noses, and most of them are actually quite angular shaped, like what we were saying before. They're not quite what you think you see isn't necessarily what you see. So this is quite an unusual nose, which is why I keep stopping. I'm stopping more regularly to look at the reference image, because I want to make sure that I'm doing what I should be doing. On an inward angle ever so slightly, and erase the outside one to neaten it up. And you can see already how it's taking shape. Now they have quite a big nose for their face, which is interesting. And it's shaped very much like a dog. So if you've got any pets, a dog at home, or maybe even a cat, it's not quite cat-like, but it'll teach you. Yeah, take a good look at them, because a lot of these nose structures are very similar. Even though I'm saying it's different and it's big, and the actual shapes that you use to put it together, they're very similar among, especially mammals. And you'll notice the nose protrudes quite far out from the face too. And I'm just going to draw a line in here where the pigments change. Now we don't need to be too focused with the nose, because even though it is a big fat part of his face, it's also quite dark. So remember earlier when I was saying that it doesn't have to be exact all of the time. This is one of those. They have lots and lots of notches and cracks in their nose, and we're probably not going to need to get those exactly the same, but we can give the illusion, a bit like magic, which will come later. Another thing I'll say is, while you're on this stage, just doing outlines, don't work too hard with your pencil. And by that I mean don't press really hard down, because what you'll do is you'll start damaging the paper and you'll make things more difficult for yourself, especially with regards to if you need to erase. We work very lightly until we're confident that what we've done is the way we want it. And I'm just going to neaten up some bits around the edges. So quite honestly, this part is actually your most important part. Like, if you don't get this bit right, then the rest of the drawing or painting just isn't going to fall into place as well. I'm actually going to neaten up the eye because I'm not a massive fan of that shape. Get rid of that corner off the top, and instantly it makes another softer expression. So if we make the eyes too angular, sometimes they look a bit skeptical or shocked. Same for when we're drawing eyebrows on people, to be honest. Whether you're doing makeup or actual portraits. Yeah, you get the eyebrows wrong and it can completely change the expression. And the same goes for the eyes. And we have to remember when we're drawing the eyes that, let's zoom in a little bit, even though they are this diamondy shape towards this teardroppy shape, they're not, they're actually spherical, so we've got to make sure that when we end up drawing them properly, when we fill it in and start introducing shade and light, that we remind ourselves that this is a round object, it's like a marble, and any reflections or light shining on the eye, it needs to go in that same rounded kind of shape. Right, now let's get this offside stroke in. And for those of you who are working traditionally, please make sure that your pencil stays sharp. Working digitally right now, I don't have that problem, but if you are working with pencils or charcoals especially, you're going to lose your point quite often and it's going to make things a pain to deal with. So keep that point sharp, even if you've got to do it every 5 minutes. I recommend having multiples of the same type of pencil that you're using. That's normally the way I work. Have a few sharpened at once and then you don't have to do it as often. So now I'm just defining it a little bit more on the edges, just so I know where I'm going, and we'll start filling in later on. So just drafting the markings. Just very roughly. And roughly marking in the lights and darks. And neatening up some areas as we go. We've got quite a variegated coat. The more you look at it, the more different markings and everything you see. Right, so now we've got our lines in, we can get going with the light and shade, and this is where the grey paper really comes into it. If you haven't been drawing on grey paper, don't worry, you can still do this. But for those of you who have been using tinted paper, it's so nice because it's like it's a nice mid-tone to start with, and it means you can map out your lights and darks very easily by using a white pencil or white chalk or white charcoal, and it just enables us to get a little bit more of a 3-dimension. If you're working on white paper, all you have to do is use your darker tones. So you've been using a H or a HB so far, so you'll probably be moving on to like 2 to 4Bs for your lighter tones, and then 5 and 6B for your mid tones, and anything from like an 8 or 9B maybe for your blackest blacks. For those of you who are working digitally, we're just changing the opacity, which is this little slider here, and that'll change darkness or brightness. Well, actually it changes transparency, but it's a similar effect, and that's what matters. So I always start working with the white first and get the brightest brights in. If you see me using this smudge tool, for anyone working traditionally, you can do that with either what I call a smudge stick, which is pictured on the screen now, or just your finger is fine. And we want to make sure when we're filling in that we're always going in the direction of the fur, and this applies to anything: fur, feathers, hair, even things like skin. Like when you're doing people, you'll notice there's a certain contour and a way everything goes, like directions of wrinkle lines and things like that. So you can literally apply this to anything. Now, if you're working traditionally, again, make sure that your white pencil or whatever you're using stays sharp, because it'll help keep control. In softer, fluffier areas, it's actually worth letting it go a little bit blunt, just to fill in a bit easier. I'm actually simulating that with the digital version of what is supposed to be a 6B pencil. So 6Bs are quite soft, they're getting into normal blacks, they're getting into the darker tones. The softer the graphite, the stronger the pigment, but in digital we can use our 6B to do white instead, and you can see it's much more light and fluffy than my previous lines. And don't worry too much if you go too far with your whites, because you can always go over them in darks. It's much harder to erase darker tones traditionally than it is the lighter. I'll probably re-go over this again with a finer drawing pencil just to get some more detail at some point. But right now this is really useful for just sketching in the details that we want. It's such an interesting shaped head, like you can tell that they're designed for burrowing and living underground, and just by the streamlined shape of them, and you can tell they rely a lot on sense of smell, just by the sheer size of their nose and its flexibility. And badgers are omnivores, which means they're like us. They can eat both plants and meat. But most of them actually live on things like earthworms and slugs and snails, small mammals, sometimes small birds, anything they can get hold of really. And that's quite evident when you see like this long snout that is very well developed for shuffling around in the dirt and looking through anything that might be scurrying around. They have these huge claws as well, but they're mostly used for digging. And when we're going for our outlines, try and stay loose. Don't stick to the draft that we've done. Like, add little wispy bits around the edges, like especially where these tassely bits on the ears are, because it'll really make them look fluffy. Nothing has a solid outline. And we're not drawing individual hairs either, we're doing like bunches. A lot of people they'll try to do individuals and it'll look kind of like stripes and they're not quite sure where they've gone wrong, and that's normally because you've got to treat it like the structure that it is. So hair isn't individual fibres, it's like clumps. The more of a distance you get, the bigger the clumps appear. Same with like grasses and things like that. And we're just building up slowly, and the more gradual we do it, the more it's easier to see where it needs more and where it needs maybe a little bit less, and keep pulling away from it to check that it looks okay as a whole, because we've got a habit of focusing on one specific area and not looking at the picture as a whole. You see how that grey is shining through the white and it's giving a nice sense of depth. That's what we're after. Just got a little bit carried away with the ear there, so I'll just erase that a little bit. So aside from red deer, badgers are actually one of Britain's larger mammals, which is quite funny when you think of how hard they are to actually spot most times. They're really elusive, and they have quite a decent lifespan as well, approximately 10 years, which is kind of, I suppose, like our dog. But there are sets where they live, what we were discussing earlier, they can be passed down from generation to generation, and there's some that are like 1,000 years old and are still being used, which is really cool. And unlike many of our native species, badgers actually don't hibernate. They will sleep through the coldest parts of winter, but it's not really a hibernation, it's more like just an extended sleeping, but they'll stay active throughout the winter as a whole. And unfortunately, many of the places that they do live have to be kept secret because they've been persecuted through the centuries quite a lot, even now. Often blamed for things that are not proven. They have one of the biggest protections in the UK with regards to the law. You're not allowed to even disturb a set, but yet they've also been blamed for like the spread of TB and cattle and things like that, and so they've actually legalised culling at the minute. There's approximately, I think last time I read there was something like 48,000 that have been shot, and these guidelines even go against the government's own standards. So charities like the Badger Trust are actually working really hard to get that overturned right now. And the plan is, if we can get culling replaced with vaccination, for example, then it'll be better for both worlds, really, for both the farmers and the badgers. I always hope that one day we can just live peacefully side by side with nature. Almost make sure that you're really observing when you're drawing light, because it behaves in ways that'll surprise you. It's not always where you think it'll be. Like, there's the obvious things, like the sun's obviously coming from this direction, maybe a bit more from above, but light also reflects off things. So like, from the ground, for example, I mean, underneath here it's still got some light bits catching, and a lot of people just instinctively fill those in. So always keep looking at your reference, whether it's a photograph or real life, and just observe nature in general. Once you learn how things like light behave, you can start to make your own up and completely change an image. Lighting affects the mood and the emotions of the piece and everything. It's definitely worth educating himself on and learning about. So right now I know it looks like I'm just doing the white parts of the badger, but because it's the lightest part, the brightest part, it's worth doing first. Now obviously if you've started with white paper, you've got to be aware that you've got to try and preserve those whites of the paper, because you'll never get anything as bright as that again. So you're actually working in reverse to me. You'll be shading where I've left the greys behind. Now around the face, the fur is quite neat, so we don't want to do too many scraggly edges where the neat smoother hair is. It'll look scruffy or like he's wet or something like that. If you ever get an animal looking too spiky, it's because you've defined the fur too well. You just need to fill it in a little bit more. And just filling in the shady bits a little bit more in white, just because they are looking a little bit too intense. I've got a cheekbone protruding out here, so there's a nice highlight that we want to keep quite bright. I just realised I forgot to take my grid off. So yeah, if you're working traditionally, make sure you erase your grid before you start filling in. I totally forgot to mention that. Digitally, it doesn't really matter so much whether or not you want to keep it, because it works as a layer on top, so you can turn it off whenever you want. Well, this part of the body is very fluffy, so we'll keep it scruffy and rough around the edges. As long as you get the hairs going in the right direction. And you'll notice with most animals that the fur will gradually come round, but the badgers, the fur tends to come swooping up, and I think it's probably partly because they're burrowing animals, so if all the fur goes in the same direction, it helps them move easier while they're digging through the ground and stuff like that. It's always worth learning about the animal as a whole and thinking about the environments they come from, because that'll help you understand why the anatomy is the way it is. Now I'm actually filling this in more than I need to, but this section I think will be a lot easier to build up darks into rather than leave them in to show through. Certain areas I'll probably leave, but and notice again how we're doing bunches together, not just loose hairs, and it just helps shape it up. But I'm being careful around this jawline so that I don't lose it for when I'm putting in other details. At the same time, we don't want a definite line. We want it kind of broken up a little bit. And then we get some like almost like grey highlights through here. Technically we're more on the brown side, but we're not working in colour, so I'll refer to them as glares. And it's quite a long shaggy coat around this area. It's quite dense. Probably because here in the UK it's very, well, it's normally cold, depending on which part of the country you're in. The south tends to be more warm, but up north where I am, we do get more of the winds from the coast and stuff. And it's okay if the fair isn't perfectly even, because if you look, it's not on him either. And I'll probably start filling him out around the edges to give him kind of a portrait type feel. Calling it a he, it might even be a she, we don't know. I'm noticing the closer we get to the leg, the more it's turning into kind of stripes. They do help give a little bit of shape to the body. And then we have some along the back. Now the further apart we make our pencil lines, the darker he looks against the grey, you see. Whereas the closer together they are, the brighter it looks. So just lightly sketching in fair, not being too specific, but keeping an eye on where those lights come through and where the darks are. Now you'll notice some of these markings are kind of in rows. And although this badger looks really bright and visible where it is in the photo, these markings will actually serve to camouflage him really well, especially among dappled shade like in the woods or forest. And it's important to observe how these structures are formed. Now I'm just touching up areas before we go into our next shade, and you'll start to see him really pop once we start doing the other parts. It's all about patience. There's a point in every drawing where it looks awful and you've just got to persevere through it. Sometimes it's worth starting again, but most times it's just because it's halfway through, and if you know your lines are right, just keep persevering with it, because it will get there in the end. You need to know when to stop as well if you're becoming obsessed with a certain area. I always put it away for like maybe a week and don't look at it at all, and I'll just forget it's there. I won't acknowledge its existence at all. It'll be like the naughty corner, I suppose. And after a week I'll go back to it, and all of a sudden that mistake that, well, what I thought was there, turns out wasn't such a big deal. Or if it is, it's actually really easy to sort, because I've got a clear head and I've not been staring at it for several days in a row like I have been previously, because there's nothing worse than overworking as well. Yeah, you can underwork, but you can also overwork it, and we definitely don't want that. I will do the highlights in the eye. It's always one of my favourite bits. And remember before we were saying the eye isn't oval or teardrops, it's spherical, it's in a socket. The only reason it looks the shape it does is because of the skin around the eye. But it's still marble shaped, so we need to remember that when we're dropping this light in. And when we're doing the darks. I'm going to use our smudge tool a little bit just to take the definition up. Now sometimes when I'm drawing traditionally or painting, I'll actually put the shine in the eye last, and I'll use something called gouache, which is like a chalky paint. I often find that can be the most effective way. You can even smudge with an eraser as well if you use it very lightly and it's very soft. But just be aware that it does kind of ruin your eraser, so you don't really, if you don't want to spend hours cleaning it afterwards, scrubbing it on your easel or whatever, then I recommend like a paper stump or something like that. A smudge stick, basically. And now for the nose. So I tend to use quite a broken circular type motion on noses, just to get that cracked and textured look, because they're not as smooth as they appear. There's lots of saws and shrugs to the nose. They've got an amazing sense of smell. This is even easier to do if you've got textured paper as well. Just let your pencil run over the tooth of the paper, catching the edges. It creates a really nice effect. So now we can start going into the darks. And the more we do of the darks, the more will become clear where our light needs to be. So we don't just do the white and then give up on it. We'll eventually just keep touching up both until it looks right. And you often find, because the eye creates an optical illusion, that the lightest lights will have the darkest darks next to them. It's not always the case, but most times it is. So we do have quite a nice dark line against the stripe, for example. But this part that I'm doing now is even darker because it's in shade, so I'm going to put this in just so I know where we're going with it all. And although we're following a certain direction with it, we don't have to be too neat because we're just blocking the sun at the minute. Try and stay loose so that if you need to take areas darker you can, and if they're too light you can always go back in later on. You'll find the softer the pencil you use, the harder it is to erase, so it's where you need to start being careful with it. So for this particular one, I'd probably, if I was working traditionally, I'd be using something like a 6 or an 8B. It actually depends on the brand as well. It's always worth doing a swatch on a piece of sacrificial paper beforehand, just to work out what kind of pressure you need and things like that. Personally, I don't like pencils that I have to work hard to get results from, so for me, Faber-Castells, and I'm not sponsored to say this, I just really like them. They're one of my favourites. A lot of people like Derwents, which are kind of like a middle ground for me. If I'm out of Faber-Castells, I'll move on to my Derwent pencils. And you see how instantly that dark against the white has made the white pop even more. Now for most of this I'm actually using something between a sharp and blunt pencil. It's kind of like on its way to bluntness but not quite. And it's really nice for getting fair because it still gets the point, but it's also easier to feather in. And you can achieve it just by, after you've sharpened it, if you either go into an area where you do need a lot of heavy use, or just have a scrap piece of paper on hand just to scribble over it so it's slightly blunted. Personally, I think that's a waste though, so if I was blunting a pencil, I would be going into this chin area and where it's almost pure black and just blunting the pencil as I go. And once you get it to a softness that you really like, you can abandon that area and go back into the other area. So as we're building up, even in this really dark area, we still need to be aware that there are differences in variations to tones, shades. And you'll notice I jump around with my drawings a lot. I do this without even thinking. And it's just because I see something and I'll be like, ooh, that needs to be there. And I just want to neaten it up a little bit. And we can actually see him taking shape now. He's beginning to come to life. You notice I'm leaving variegated lines amongst the shade, and that's just to define the fur a little bit more. It's also worth noting, try not to make your strokes too long, unless it's like needed, because the longer you do your strokes, the longer and more shaggy the hair will look. And you can see on this part there's a nice highlight revealing itself. Now as well, if you're doing this in colour, you've got to look at the different variations of light in the cut, because this badger isn't black and white, right? In this lighter tone, you can see on the stripe, it's just variations of blue, more than black. Maybe in the darkest darks, but generally no, it's even that darker tone near the cheek isn't black. And there's even shades of blue and yellow in the white if you look. And learning to observe colour in that way will really help your work. Even the grey, it's not grey. If you look, it's warm and it's kind of like a browny. If I was doing it in watercolours, I'd use something like raw umber or something, or yellow ochre. So now I've told you the main point, I'm probably going to time lapse the rest of this just so that the video doesn't take like several hours. So if I think of anything to say between then, I'll let you know. And now it's time for the big reveal. So you'll notice that I have added a background to this drawing. You can do that really easily. Basically it's just variegated tones of pencil or charcoal, and then you smudge it. Personally, I'd say if you're doing it traditionally, to do it first before you do the subject itself, because you end up smudging the edges of the drawing. When you're doing it digital, it's not so bad because you can do it in a different layer. If you liked this video, please like and share and leave a comment, and follow us across social media and subscribe to our YouTube. I would love to know what you thought of this video and if you'd like to see me do any more. So if you were watching this from the MFPA pages, please head over to LippyArt and leave me a message and let me know. Thank you for watching.